Great. Thank you, Mary. Just give you guys a little information about myself, I guess a little more on Mary, of course, with the introduction. I've been dealing with pivot tables in Excel for a few years now. If you have any questions during this training or during this, I guess, webinar, feel free to, again, post it in the chat or interrupt me and answer while we're talking. I have no problem with that. If I speak too fast or I need to, I guess, rephrase something, feel free to chime in and let me know. I have no problem with doing that and reiterate anything that's said. Before we get too far into it, before we actually start sharing and going into pivot tables, I know a lot of you guys are commenting in the group chat your experience and how you strongly feel about using pivot tables. Let's say from a 1 to a 5, of course, 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. So what I'm going to do today in this next hour is go over how to create a pivot table, some nice little tricks that could help you guys make pivot tables even faster, what to look out for when creating pivot tables, what you need to know when you actually create a pivot table from the beginning, the differences between the filter, the column, the row, and the value fields, how to sort and format pivot tables, how to change the pivot table design to make it look more appealing, of course, for your audience or for whoever you're actually giving this information to, and then creating the pivot table charts themselves that match and go on top of your actual pivot table, excuse me. Now, just for everyone else, if you're not muted, if you can mute, that'd be great, because I am hearing a little bit of an echo currently. Great, thank you for that. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. If you cannot see my screen, let me know. And just for verbal confirmation, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Yes. Awesome. So we're going to get started. Okay, great. Good. If you cannot see my screen or something else happens, let me know. But while we're going through this, just stay muted so we can get through this pretty quickly. So what I have here is an example of a pivot table with some fake data. Just to give you guys an overview, this is just some fake forward shipment data I just made up. So it's nothing accurate or actually real. We have, of course, some raw data. I have Jill's raw data for what she actually sent out to different states. Also have some raw data from Bob. The difference you see here, of course, is we actually made Jill's data actual table in Excel, and Bob's raw data is not. And we'll go back to this a little bit later on, but I just want to point that out while we're looking at it. Also, if you haven't seen it yet, in the group chat, if you go early on in the chat, you'll see a link for Google Drive. You can actually download this pivot table. If you want to follow along with me as well, you can. But I wanted to show you guys just this simple pivot table with an actual slicer as well as a pivot chart. As you can see, it's very basic. It shows, of course, what trucks. I can filter it based on the state. So go ahead and backtrack. These are actual, of course, truck or car, whatever model it is that Ford sells. The actual state, I can narrow it down based on North Carolina and just see what's sold in North Carolina or shipped to North Carolina dealerships. I can change it back to all. I can see the total number ordered of each vehicle, the sum cost for those vehicles based on the individual cost per car or truck or SUV. I can see the percentage total, as in what that cost accounts to for the overall value of the $5,632,000. A chart that separates that out based on just a simple looking pie chart that shows me chunks and I guess portions for each vehicle. So it looks like F-150 from here is the largest chunk, so it's the most sold. And then I can actually, the slicer I was doing before, down below. I can actually, 1 second. What this can do is actually pick a different category on the fly. So I can pick an SUV or a car or just trucks to be able to show what that is totally, and then clear that filter out. What I'm going to do today is go over how each of these are made, go over some extras that may not be visible or may not be shown here just because the data really can fit that, and how to create it. So first, we're going to go over how to create a pivot table from scratch. Now, a lot of you guys may know that already, but I want to show you a little something extra that may be helpful. So I'm going to do a new sheet. I'm going to go to Insert. And you'll see an option right here at the top list says Pivot Table. I'm not going to click that yet. To the right, on Excel 2013, this actually wasn't available in 2010, if I remember correctly. If you click on Recommend Pivot Tables, and I select the data I'm going to select, I'm going to go back to Jill's data and select that data for now. Let's try this one more time. There you go. What it does with Recommend Pivot Tables, it actually gives me kind of a pre-selected filter options automatically. So you may not know exactly what you want when you look at raw data, and it can be very daunting when you see a lot of columns, a lot of data, a lot of rows, and not sure exactly what you need or want from the data right yet. You just know you have a lot of it. What this does is gives you some options, some simple options. Says, hey, you know what? Do you want just the sum of the total order per category, or do you want the actual total cost per category? And you have to scroll down and gives you a lot of options here. Now it'll give you more options based on how many actual data points you have, how many columns you have. But this is really great for anyone who's in a rush, or if you just want to see something simple. You know, I don't know exactly what I want, but let's look here and see what I need. What I'm going to do though is actually make a pivot table from scratch instead of using recommended pivot tables. So click on pivot table. It's going to give me a couple of options. The first option is select the table range. This is where I want to actually pick my table or my raw data. I'm going to go ahead and select Jill's data again for now. Now, before I click anything else, I want to explain these other options that are here also. Using an external data source. What this is referring to is either databases like Access, SQL, or just text files or text like Notepad. You can actually import that data as well. I'm not going to really go that in too much detail today, just because there's a lot of information there that I don't deal with directly, but it's something good to know if you do have any kind of database files or text files, you can import those as well. You don't have to necessarily use a worksheet. Of course, you can also choose if you want an existing sheet or if you want to make a new worksheet altogether, a new tab altogether, which is nice. I usually open up a new tab and name it something else, or just open a new tab anyway and do it by default that way, but it's your choice, you can do that. This bottom option is actually only available in 2013 Excel. And what this is referring to is you're actually able to use multiple worksheets with different data points and then link them together as a relationship. So if I have just kind of like a database like Access, if you have a worksheet with lots of customers' information, and then you have another worksheet with receipts and costs for specific customers, I can actually join those into a single pivot table as long as there's a unique identifier tying both those together. I'm not going to go over that today. It is a new feature only for 2013 that does that. And just to take a break, is there any questions so far? Okay, I'm going to take silence as a good thing. So let's go ahead and create this chart for now. Oh. Hold on one second, guys. I'm going back and forth. Let's try this one more time.
Hey, Joey, we do have a question for you or John. And the question is the advanced feature that you just showed also available in 2016?
So that is a good question. I know 2016 is for Office 360, and I'm not familiar with that. I would assume so, but I do not know. I can take that away and try to reply back, or maybe get information on that later on for you guys, though. John, do you know by chance, off the top of your head?
Yeah, I was actually just taking a look because I do have a copy of 2016 Office, and I do have the same option available in 2016 Office as well.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, John. So I went and used Bob's data to actually make a pivot table for now. Not sure why Jill's giving me a problem. You already made a pivot table before with the exact same data. So we're going to go ahead and actually make a pivot table with Bob's data. Now, Bob's shipment data looks like this. This is usually what raw data looks like. It's plain text, nothing really formatted. There might be a formula or two. And the reason why I'm bringing this up about the raw data is your pivot table is only going to be as good as the raw data you receive. And what I mean by that is if you don't have enough data points to be able to make a constructive and actually viable pivot table, then you either need to do one of two things. Update your columns and get more data from the system you're actually exporting the data from. Or, excuse me, two, you need to actually work with the data and add more columns yourself to be a little custom. And what I mean by that is adding additional columns. I might say, okay, this dealership, I know the name of it based on the ID, it's gonna be this name. Or if I need to find that instead of just the state, I need to find the city the dealership is located to for this reference, for this data point, I need to do that and add a column for that as well and find that data separately. In this case, we're not gonna do that, but that's something to think about when you're creating pivot tables, and going through that raw data is crucial and important when you go over it. So I'm gonna rename the tab, pivot table 2, just for reference for this. I would stay away from not labeling your tabs. You won't be able to keep track of the summary data, keep track of where it's going and what's happening. Now what I can do, and this is the fun part, is where you actually add fields. On the right, this option is automatic. Let me go ahead and actually I'm going to shrink this down a little bit for you, make me a little bit easier for you guys. Give me 1 second.
And so while Joey is manipulating that, just to let everyone know, we are recording this session and we will have this posted on YouTube. And if you do have questions after the session, Karen's got my email address. Don't hesitate to email those and we will definitely help you guys out.
Great, thank you, Mary. And what I want to just show you guys before I get too far into the fields, at the top, you'll see an additional tool on the ribbon bar that says pivotable, pivotable, or pivot table, looks like it's combined, tools. Analyze and design are the main tool you'll see. You'll see a third one when you go over charts. We're gonna go over this a little bit later, but for now, I wanna show you just the pivot table fields on the right that are automatic and they're by default. What you're able to do on this field, the actual pane you see, you can change the look and feel of it. If you just want one versus the other, if you want just the fields only, if you want just the area section below 2 by 2, or you want it by 1 by 1. I keep it by default, but this is up to you guys if you want to have a different feel or look, or if you want to read it in a different way. We're not going to use the more tables option because that's actually dealing with the feature we saw before that creates a new pivot table and links them together into a relationship. So we're not going to go right now, but what I do want to point out at the very bottom right here, it says defer layout update. What that means is I can check that box. If you're working with a lot of data, 20,000, 30,000, millions even lines of code and data points, every time you add a field or make an update, it may take minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, however much memory you have in your PC or how much your domain is. It will cause it to lag, take a while for the update, and just slow down everything. So what you're able to do, you can defer the layout update, click this box, make all your changes you want in the fields, and then click update manually and update it all at once, instead of having to update every single time you make a little change, which is really beneficial for you guys that are using a lot of data. Maybe not so much if you only have a few hundred lines of data, but when you get to the thousands, tens of thousands, and so on, that's where that defer layout update is key and helps a lot, just with time, and you can do it at the very end. So I'm gonna keep it unchecked for now. So what I want to do here is actually I want to bring the products over. Once I bring products over and drag it down to rows, you're going to see the actual product labels to the far left. So now I want to know, okay, I want to bring the value over. This is what we need to determine, do I want the cost, do I want the number ordered, what do I want? So I want to bring the ordered number of the shipments of the cars that actually were sent out, so the total for each. So bring the values, and it automatically gives me the value to the right. Now, what it's doing though, if you notice, this doesn't look right. If I go back to Bob's data, that was Bill for 2 seconds. Bob's data, if I stole 3 Explorers, that doesn't seem right, because I'm looking here, and I see 2 just from one dealer automatically, and I see 4 here, so that number's not adding up. Why it's not adding up is because this is a count of the number ordered. It's default that way. If I click the drop-down arrow beside count of number ordered, and click on value field settings, I can change what it's actually calculating here. So what I want is the sum. You'll notice here you have other options too, the average, the max, the min, even count numbers, and a lot of other variations that you may or may not use. I know the most common I use is sum, count, and the average. So I'm gonna do sum, so it actually gives me the total ordered for each product, each actual car or vehicle. You'll also notice on the left at the bottom of the row, you'll see a blank option. The reason why that's there is when I actually selected the data, I did the whole columns like this. All this blank data is being brought over. What I usually do is actually edit the table and just filter that out later on and not show it like this. Now, the reason why I do it this way versus just doing only here, and you guys that deal with pivot tables now may notice this as well, when you start adding more raw data and your raw data rows change number every single time you have to update the pivot table, it becomes a hassle to change and update the data every single time. It's actually a lot simpler and a lot more efficient to just do all the columns instead of just that field. Does that make sense? Does anyone have questions about that so far? Okay, good. I'm gonna take silence as a good thing. So now what we want is we want to actually add the cost. So I'm gonna add the total cost to the values as well. And again, it's giving me count, which is worthless in this case. So I'm gonna change it back to the sum, because I want to keep it as sum. But this format looks wonky. I don't like the format of just the number. I want it to be actually in a dollar value. So what I'm gonna do is right click as all those cell blocks are highlighted, go to format cells, and change it to accounting. Now, you can keep it to decimal places. None of my values actually have cents involved, so I'm gonna remove the decimal places. So that looks a lot cleaner for you guys, a lot easier. Now what I want though is I want a percentage of the total. Now what you'll notice though at the far right, I see nothing over here that says a percentage. So what I need to do now is figure out how do I do that? Well, there's a couple ways to do it. I'm not gonna do the more complicated way. You're actually able to make a custom field over here to show and display. That's a calculated field. I'm gonna go over that a little bit later to just show you how you can do that a little bit. But for now, I'm gonna show you the simpler way to do it. Because I want the total cost percentage, I want to know the total dollar amount for say the edge, Ford Edge, 330,000. How much is that percentage-wise compared to the grand total of 3 million? To do that, bring total cost down, drag it below values, even though it's already in there, and you're gonna notice it's gonna default back to count again. I'm actually gonna change this to sum, so now we have duplicates. But if I right-click over here and say summarize values by, show values as, these two options are your best friend. These are quick options to change if you, oh man, I actually did count, we'll go back to average, or actually go back to sum, either or. But show values as, I'm gonna do it as a percentage of the grand total. So now it shows me a nice percentage, calculates it automatically for me, which is a big deal, which is great. I don't have to do any kind of formulas or anything extra to show that it does it automatically for me. Now you may notice that these column headings aren't exactly friendly. I don't like them, I want to change them. You can double click and change them that way, or actually pull up the menu to change them this way. Or if you right click and do field settings, it'll bring you here as well. So do either or when you actually change these settings. So I'm gonna do percentage. Great. Total, I'm gonna do total. So actually do overall value. I like that better. Overall cost, actually change that. And I'm gonna keep some of ordered number ordered, keep that the same. So now I have my total ordered of each vehicle. I have the overall cost of all ordered, and I have the percentage of the overall. So now what I want to do is actually sort this data differently. I want to sort it based on the highest cost of the overall cost, the highest amount value, the highest value itself.
Hey, Joey.
Okay,
Sorry, Joey. We've got a question on how you got that percentage, how you made it change.
I will show you. So you asked me how I changed the title or actually changed it to a percentage?
Changed it to a percentage.
Okay, I'll show you. What I had to do, if you right click over one of the cell blocks, as long as it's in this column, show value as. It's a little, looks like a right arrow drop down in the right click area. Show value as, you have a ton of options here. The one I use mostly is a percentage of grand total. If you click that, it automatically changes it from a cost to a regular number to a percentage. Does that answer your question? I think it was from Christina. Now, of course, this can change to be difference from, running total in, and a lot of other options. It just really depends on what you're looking for, what you need to do. Okay, great. Now what I want to do is organize this based on the highest overall cost or highest selling of something value-wise. The way you can do that is a couple of options. What I'm going to do is right-click here. You say sort, smallest to largest, largest to smallest. Well, I want the highest at the top, so I'm going to do largest to smallest. So what it does now is my F-150 is the most sold, most shipped vehicle, most shipped truck for Ford. So that's why it's the highest cost and it's the highest percentage, which is a big deal when you're actually displaying information to anyone, really. You usually want to know the top three, either highest cost, highest selling points, most valued. That's what they're looking for, the quick glance. Boom, I can see the top three is the F-150, the Explorer, and the Edge. Now you may say, well, I don't want to do it that way. I actually want to organize it A to Z instead. You have a couple options. I'm going to actually click up here in the ribbon itself for pivot table tools. You click on Analyze. You'll see options up here kind of automatically show. Then you go to Design, the same thing. So for Analyze, you're able to refresh data and select different data and different field options, but you can also change the name of the pivot table as well. I'm going to go over this a little bit later. But the main thing here is what I want to show you guys is some options you can collapse and expand based on what it is. Now, you'll see some of these options are available, but they won't necessarily work. Anyways, I want to show you guys that before we go into it in a second. When you actually organize and sort, when you right-click on the tab itself, the little drop-down arrow for rows, sort A to Z or Z to A are labeled and selectable. If you do A to Z, it actually changes the overall cost sorting that I did largest to smallest before and goes back to alphabetically. So that's something to think about when you're actually showing the data. Do you care more about alphabetically, Z to A to Z, or do you care more about the highest cost or the highest number of whatever field you're looking at? So any questions about that so far? Or any concerns? Okay, I'm gonna take silence as a good thing. So now what I wanna do is I'm gonna actually go over more of the fields down here, what you can do. So you already talked a little about rows. I can actually add more to the rows, but you'll notice if I add more things to the rows, it'll start going down lower levels based on how I have it organized in the row field or the filters field, the columns field, or values field. This is something to think about when you don't mind seeing extra options. Now these all can be collapsed. Kind of what we talked about earlier in the ribbon. We click collapse field. Everything's collapsed and organized neatly like you had it before. Again, expand field, now everything shows again. Now, date delivered may not be a good way to put it. I actually rather do it by category. So I'm gonna do it by category and it shows that, which is not really helpful. Let me move category to the top. And now you can see, okay, I can see the category as a whole for each one. And then if I want to expand it, how many cars, I can see the subtotal, the overall value for each car. Which is helpful if you want to be able to drill down and be able to show different options. Of course, when you drill down or drill up in that regard, it's built into the function itself. If you notice at the top in the ribbon, you'll see drill down and drill up. These mainly deal with when you actually connect and have a relationship with multiple pivot tables, So that you won't necessarily use unless you actually have a relationship with multiple data that we talked about before a little bit. But in this case, you can drill down manually by clicking the expand or collapse to see what's going on with each of these data fields. So I'm gonna remove this though for now, and we'll go back to it a bit later. Right now though, you may notice this field, this whole pivot table is not exactly pleasing to look at. It needs to be changed a little bit. So I'm gonna go to design in the ribbon. You'll see right here, pivot table styles. If you expand it, you'll see light options and medium options and dark options by default. Now, if you want to dive deep into this, you can actually make your own custom style if you'd like. If you got time to do that, that's great. And if you're able to do that, awesome. A lot of times though, a lot of the styles are already preset and they're very helpful. So in this case, let's pick, I don't like that. Let's do this one. I'm gonna do, let's say a light orange, light yellow color. Maybe light yellow. Now, this is easy to read, but I like actually highlighting every other row. So right here in design, you'll see some other options that you can check box. Row headers, column headers usually checked by default. Banded rows and banded columns. What that's referring to is banded rows, it actually highlights them differently. Now, actually, you can't really tell too well. Let's change this format and see if we can do something a little better. Try that guy instead. You can kind of tell the difference now with the borders, but even though it's a light color, let's go darker. That might be a little easier for you guys to see and read. Don't like that, don't like that. It just makes it a lot easier to read with those lines and be able to tell the difference. Now you can do the columns as well, but I don't usually do that. That's something you guys be able to change each one, which one you want to do. Now if you go back to analyze, you see a lot of the other options up here. You can name the pivot table specifically if you want, if you feel like you're gonna have multiple pivot tables and be able to pinpoint where they are and link them together. The active field, of course, is what shows here, what you're able to do. You can change the field settings here, but it's the same thing you were doing before when you were right-clicking on the drop-down over here. Actually click on the drop-down before. Insert slicer and insert timeline. These are some really cool features that can be helpful and give you information at quick glance a little more visually appealing, and also help out with, just how to actually show the data if you don't want to add more filters. So I'm going to insert a slicer. Now the cool thing about the slicers is they're not dependent on what you actually have in the table itself. It's pulling from all the data columns, all the available fields in the raw data you selected before. So in this case, I'm going to click on category because we don't have anything in category here showing it, and I won't be able to click at a drop of a hat what shows and what doesn't show. So this is really cool, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this topic or familiar with this at all, but it can be very helpful at a glance to click through different things without a filter, or even on top of a filter if you don't want to show it all the way. So in this case, I want to see just the car data. If I click the car data, that's all it shows. If I click just the SUV data, that's all it shows. If I click just the truck, that's all it shows. If I want to clear that filter, I click the little filter with the X mark beside it. Now, this blank space shows here, and it's not really visually appealing. So I can right click and click on slicer settings and remove that completely. So I can actually hide the items with no data. You can also change if it's descending or ascending, and a couple of options, even name it as well if you like to. Actually, let's name it something different. I'd rather change this name of it for sure. Let's do car, no, let's do vehicle categories. So great. So now I have the actual pivot table. I have a slicer that goes with it. And to add to the slicer, I don't use these too often, but you may see a benefit for this when you're actually using a lot of data that's time specific or a specific deadline, or shows when something's delivered on time, completed on time, what have you. If you click on insert timeline, it's going to automatically pull any kind of column heading or any kind of data point with a date format. So I check date delivered in this case. Click OK. It's going to give me a really cool little timeline box. Now it defaults to months in this case. I don't want that though. I want it to go by days. So I'm going to scroll down to the left because right now I have a lot of dates later on, of course, in the year. But if we go back to Bob's data, it's only January, which doesn't do me any good than have all the other dates. So what I'm going to do is just go back to the front and say I want to look at January 4th. Nothing. If I go to January 3rd, hey, there's something. This is a nice visual similar to the slicer that can show you what data you have on a specific date without actually making a filter. Any questions so far about that? Okay, great. Now going back to the Analyze ribbon, you went over a lot of these other options already. I know the collapse and expand field, we did display it a little bit earlier. if there's more drop downs or more options in the rows, you can show that here and actually expand and collapse those options. Grouping and ungrouping, this may be beneficial based on what kind of data you're trying to show, or if you want to make a whole new group, a custom, I guess, name, instead of what you have already in the fields. So I can actually group, let's say we group Edge, Escape, and Explorer together. Like a group selection, what it's going to do automatically is add a group name that's custom to it, just by default group. And then it's going to group them together for you to be able to see them. I can also add a subtotal that concludes with this too. So this may be a different, say, grouping, separate from the category or anything else we actually have in the field. And John makes a good point in the chat. Because I selected all data and the way I did it is going to show all the dates in there. So that's something to think about when you're actually creating those dates or doing those dates. Excuse me. But great, so I'm actually remove this group because I don't like this group. I really don't need it. So I'm going to go back to analyze, ungroup, now it's gone. So you actually remove that group altogether because I don't need it for this data point at least. Now refresh and change source data, or change data source. If for some reason you feel like the data is not correct or accurate, you can hit refresh manually, hit the drop down, refresh all, refresh a certain data point. Or if you're noticing, you know what, it's not selecting the right data, I can change the data source. And what that means is, of course, you're picking a new data frame for it to actually pick up and select. Boom. So now I'm actually looking at Jill's data. So I just switched over to Jill's data instead of Bob's data. Now you have a clear, select, and move pivot table option. These are just straightforward. You can move the pivot table over if you need to, or move to a different option. If you want to select the entire pivot table or just different fields and values and labels, you can do that here. Unless instead you just want to highlight it this way, manually by dragging or actually hovering over it. And then you clear selection, which could be very dangerous if you don't want to mess up your formatting or mess up anything. Field odds and sets. I don't know if you guys remember earlier during this little seminar that I mentioned calculated fields instead of doing the custom fields underneath values you can make this way. So if you go value field settings, oh, I saw something pop in the chat. I will go over Slicer in just a second. Let me show this to you guys real quick. So value field settings is where you can actually change what shows average, count, and sum, and show value as a grand total or percentage. If you actually create a calculated field though, what this is doing, you're actually gonna make your own field, and you can do any kind of formula or value here that's custom based on, like, say, if you want to divide all, we'll do the total cost. If I want to divide total cost and make it in decimal places instead of a dollar value for some reason, it's just easier to calculate that way. I can customize that here and divide it by 100 in the field. So we'll label this decimal. And then I make formula, the total cost, insert field, divided by 100, and actually make that field here. I haven't used this too often. I feel a lot of times you can get this accomplished most of the time with the data that's built in here with the fields automatically. And here's when we need it. If you also notice, you can add some formulas, actually show formulas here as well if you need to, that everything is going on in this actual pivot table. And after that, we'll stop there for now and go over Slicer. A Slicer, of course, is this box right here with category. I'm going to delete the Slicer for now and show it again. So if we go to Analyze, Insert Slicer in that ribbon. If you click on Insert Slicer, it gives you all the actual column data points in the pivot table. So in this case, I'm going to do state instead of category, just to show what that looks like. Now, you'll see this is a lot more data because it shows, instead of just the 3 categories, showing all the states that are referenced in the material itself or in the actual data point. Okay, the toolbar, if you click on the pivot table, click on Analyze, you'll see Insert Slicer right below there. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 over underneath filter, the main filter data point. When you click Insert Slicer, it's going to give you the options of what's available in your column headings. You can checkbox either one or multiple. So actually, we'll do another one. So we can see that here. So actually now I have 2 slicers. I can pick by SUV and Ohio, which is 6 vehicles total. Any questions or any more questions about the slicers? Okay, I'm gonna take silence as a good thing. So we'll keep just category for now, and we're going to clear the filter. Great. Go back to analyze. Relationships is similar to what it kind of goes back to what we talked about before. I'm not going to go over relationships here because I don't have the right data to be able to show that to you guys, but that's where you can actually link different data points and different sheets themselves and show one pivot table, which is really cool. It's actually really helpful. It's very similar to if you're using any kind of database software like Access or SQL. You can do that within Excel now easily because it's 2013, and like John mentioned before with the question earlier, 2016 as well. Now we have pivot charts and recommended pivot tables. Back again. So what is what I'm going to do? I'm going to go over a pivot chart, how to actually insert one. So if I click on pivot chart, it's going to give me a lot of options. Very similar to when you actually insert a chart normally for just a normal table. It's going to look the same here. I can pick line, pie, bar, and then different presets of that too. The cool thing about this is once I select the preset, I can customize it very easily in a lot of different ways. So instead of a pie chart we did before, I'm going to do a bar graph. Actually, no, I'll do a column. I think a column will be funner. Let's do this guy. Cluster column chart. So this is default. This is going to be linked to this same pivot table. So if I make any changes here, this is going to reflect it automatically. Now, a way to get around that is to make a whole new pivot table, hide it, and link it to a different chart if you don't want the data to change. But I know a lot of times if you want this table to change, you want the chart to reflect it. So that's something to think about when you're making and actually linking the pivot tables to a chart. They'll change together when you filter and edit that data. So that's something to keep in mind. You don't want it to change though. If you don't want to change, you need to link it to a whole new pivot table instead of the one you're actually using here. Let's go clear filter. So all data, great. Now this looks very plain and it's easy to read. It gives you the data you need, but I don't necessarily like it. The legend is really nice. Over here, the key, you actually show what's filtered and what shows overall at the top left, and then what the product categories, and you filter it based on that within the chart itself also. Now, of course, if you change this chart though, or change here, it's going to change both the actual pivot table, the original pivot table, and the charts. So we're going to go back to all data again. Now I want to change the look of this though. So I'm going to click the little paintbrush. It gives me a lot of preset styles over here. And I like the dark background. I think it's easy to read and it has a very flash and very good contrast. I can change the color though to be a little more colorful or be all the same color for the actual bars themselves, but you may want to be careful with that, depending on what you're trying to convey and show if you have different data points. I'm going to keep it all blue. Actually, you know what, let's do it all orange and yellow. I like that better. So this is what it shows now. I don't necessarily want this legend of this key though. So to remove the key, click the plus sign. You'll see a lot of pre-built options right here. If I check a box or even hover over it, it's going to show a demo of what that may look like, which is really cool. It's really helpful sometimes. Sometimes though, if you click on like data table, it can be a lot going on. So that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to show this data to anyone else or display it. That could be either cumbersome, one, or two, just hard to read. So I don't like the key over here, so I'm going to remove the legend. It makes it look a lot cleaner and a lot more data to actually see it. And I don't like the blank, so we're going to undo the plus and get rid of the blank data over here real quick. Boom. So it looks a lot better and a lot cleaner. Now we can add a lot more to this though. We can also change the background color pretty easily. So let's do this. I'm going to actually click up here at the top. We see ribbons. You see the analyze and design like you saw before, but now we also see format. In format, I can change a lot. I can change the color of the background, the color of the bars, the effect of the shapes, any of the text, what kind of style the text should look like. Very similar to any kind of updates you do in PowerPoint and Word when you're actually editing shapes. All those are available here with the chart itself to make it look more appealing or like a certain format or color that fits your company, which is really helpful. And one, showing the message, and two, keeping it consistent with all your other charts, data, PowerPoints, training, what have you in your organization. Now, one thing you'll notice different, if you go to design, it looks very similar, but also very different compared to the actual pivot table design. So I can change the colors here, just like I did when I clicked the little paintbrush down here. So there's two places to get the same data. I can also change and do a little quick layout update. And if I need to switch the data, I can do that here as well. Now that might have been a good bit of information, especially if you're not really familiar with the pivot charts themselves. Is there any questions about that? Great. I'm going to take silence then as a good thing for now. One thing I really didn't go over too well or too much in depth, I'll go over now as I realize I'm going over charts. We talked about sorting it different ways, but we didn't really talk about actually selecting the data. Now, this may be not necessarily obvious to a lot of people, but this may be already noticeable. You've maybe already seen this in different formats or different PowerPoints, Word. So any kind of list you use or any kind of checkbox on a website is very similar to that. If I don't want to show all the data, I'll uncheck the box for select all and just select one, like F-150s. I click OK. It's just going to show F-150s. If I want to show everything, of course, I go back to select all, and then I may want to uncheck F-150s and want to see everything but F-150s. And that's how that actual filter works. That sorter works, excuse me. So now what I'm going to go over is how to actually add a little more, maybe a little extra to the pivot table. If we have a certain percentage we want to stay above, so say the dealerships want to receive, the dealer needs to ship over 10% per month of cars and vehicles to be able to hit our quota. So we'll see right here that some of these don't hit that mark. At conditional formatting, to highlight certain things if they're positive or above or below, which is really cool and really visually appealing to see right away who's hitting their goal and who's not, or where you're struggling. Maybe not as easily as highest to lowest, but it's good to see that. So what I'm going to do is actually highlight the whole column, click on conditional formatting, highlight cell rules. Now what I want to do first is I want to be able to show the benefit of who's above goal, who is above goal right away. So I'm going to do greater than. And greater than, I want it to be greater than, we'll do 10%. The greater than 10% is going to highlight green and fill with dark green text. And now I'm going to add another conditional formatting that's going to be less than. If they're less than 10%, I should do 9.99 to make sure we don't get 10% in there. Keep it dark red and there. So now we show that. Now actually what looks like it happened is, let's change this a little bit there. Now this can be helpful when you're trying to show right away who's failing or succeeding, or maybe not necessarily failing, but who's struggling. Or a good way to know is, okay, where can we fix our goals, what we're trying to solve, what we're trying to do. Now this is not really pivot tables. This goes more to just different options within Excel, but it can really help out when you're trying to show and convey certain things within a pivot table itself. So any questions so far in general? Just to recap, we went over, of course, how to create a pivot table from scratch, how to make, actually customize the data and add different filters and different fields to the pivot table itself when you're creating it, how to change the headings, and also how to change the format of the cells to dollars, for example, if we're trying to do costs, or percentage value as well. We talked about designing and actually updating the look of the pivot table. We talked about slicers. We talked about timelines. We also talked about pivot charts. And one thing to remember again with pivot charts that we said before, is the fact that the pivot chart actually reflects and is based off of the pivot table itself, the original pivot table. The only way to change that is to make a whole new pivot table and then base the chart off that new pivot table. And a good little trick you can do is throw the chart in front of the pivot table or hide the pivot table after you create the chart. So that means you have two independent, one pivot table, one charts that are not affecting each other.
So Joey, we do have a question with conditional formatting. Can you highlight an entire row, not just the percentage?
So I know in my past, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but usually you can do the whole row and it'll work no problem. For some reason, as I'm doing it now, it wants to highlight everything, which it may be because when I did the formatting before, I formatted the whole cells or all the cells to be a number or percentage, and maybe that's why. But usually, yes, you can do the whole row and it shouldn't, or the whole column and it shouldn't affect it at all because it's looking for that number. But it looks like in this case it wasn't. So I guess to be safe versus sorry, just do the percentage only or just the actual cell blocks you need to change, if that makes sense. Great. Any other questions or any other concerns?
So while we're waiting for questions, how often should pivot tables be used? And I was going to encourage everyone to download the practice sheet and play with it. So Joey, how often should pivot tables be used?
And good question. And I don't know if I necessarily have the answer for that. I think it goes more on the line of your raw data. Kind of like how I mentioned in the very beginning, the raw data speaks for itself, and the raw data is what makes a good pivot table. If you don't have the raw data to show a pivot table, then there's no need to make a pivot table. But if you have the raw data to show it and be able to display it in a good way, do it. That's when you use a pivot table. I think you don't want to use a pivot table when you deal with a lot more formulas, a lot more customization, and if there's something that you're trying to show and display that can't really be done in a chart table type format. And what I mean by that is this right now is a table. At the end of the day, this pivot table, is a table. If you can't display it in a table, what you're trying to convey, I would not use a pivot table. And I know sometimes what different I've done in the past, I've seen other people do as well, is they'll have a pivot table and then they'll have a whole block, a merge cell below it, with a lot of text and exclamation to add to that. Yes, I can show how to change the chart type. So if you select the actual chart itself, you have two ways to do it. The way I would recommend doing it is go up to Design, change chart type, chart type. You can change it that way. Now let's go to, Rare's kind of cool. It's kind of pointless for this, but yeah, look at that. So this is an example of how the charts itself can be worthless based on the data. And that's where selecting the right chart matters and actually helps you out. So let's go back to a pie chart. And let's select, I like the 3D charts, they're my favorite. I like 3D pie charts. The cool thing here, you'll see the options above still in the ribbon. I can actually pick this guy and drag it out and make it a lot more spaced, or push it together to make it closer together again, or even just one. Which helps you customize what you want to show. Now, here you'll notice there's no labels. And that's, at least to me, really annoying because we don't have a legend in here right now. And I don't like legends, but we don't have a legend here right now. So I'm going to click the plus sign and add data labels back. But right now, this doesn't really help me because the way the color looks. So let's fix this. I can change where the labels show. Actually, let's do this. I want the whole chart to show this. Boop. Boop. More options. I'm going to close the pivot table fields. You'll see data labels like this in the actual options form and be able to change them with a lot of customization. What I'm going to do, though, is fix the text. I don't want field. I want that. I don't want that. Let's change the series. I want percentage to show. I want the series. I want the category name. So right now, it's just a category with labels. And having fit right now is customized best fit. And what that means is putting it where it thinks it needs to go. But you may not like that. So we're going to change it to outside in, because I think it looks a little cleaner. Not really. Inside in is not enough space. It looks all jump up together. And center looks even worse. So I'll go back to best fit because I like how it has it fit right now. I'm not going to change the number either. So that's how you can change between chart types. And one thing you notice when I was playing around with this as well, your data labels, how crunched up they are, the font they look can all be changed, and how they look can say a lot about the data you're displaying. You can have the best data, but if your charts and your pivot table don't display that data properly, then it's really worthless. So displaying the data in a proper format where someone can read it easily and find it right away is the whole purpose of a pivot table and what you want to do to whoever you're delivering this to. Your boss, your manager, any kind of leadership you're doing this, or even just a friend, a coworker, a family member, whoever you're trying to display something to, pivot table or not, if school even, whatever you're trying to do, you want to convey that message and know what message you're trying to show to them. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters. And back to the question, of course, about pivot tables when to use them, that goes back to that. You don't want to use a pivot table if you're not really getting the meaning or point across you need to. So any questions? Any concerns?
So this is Mary, and as Joey knows, I can never stop talking. What is one thing that you learned today that you didn't know before the session started?
So looking at the, oh yeah, I was saying, sorry, Mary.
No, I was going to say, it looks like Slicer is the winner here.
Yeah, Slicer's the big one. And percentages, right. And I think going to percentages and slicers is one of those things where it's very visually appealing and a lot more user friendly to use a slicer instead of a filter. They both have their purpose, and I think you can use both interchangeably, but that slicer is where it's really cool to look at. And then same thing with the timeline. A timeline can be very beneficial if you're trying to say, you know what, this is all great data, but I see a lot of data points all over the place, time-wise. I want to see how we did in January versus February or March or on a certain day.
Well, we are just about at the end. So any last questions for Joey? And a question for the group too. Would you like some advanced training in formulas and some additional Excel things if we were able to pull that together for you? All right.
It looks like everyone's a yes.
Well, I think we may be able to put something, Karen, if that is perfect for you. But I know John was saying he would like to do a formulas class for you guys at some point.
I'm so sorry. My phone rang and I didn't hear the first part of that. What did you say, Mary?
Oh, when I asked if anyone wanted some training in advanced formulas, and it seems to be a resounding yes. And John had messaged me that he would be interested in teaching that if you are interested in having him.
Are you kidding? Of course. I just really appreciate y'all's generosity and